let me tell you a little bit about how we got to where we are. A year ago, actually not quite a year ago, we had a very large crowd here to hear Michelle Alexander and spend 4 days talking about ending mass incarceration. And we looked at the school to prison pipeline, and we looked at the impediments to reentry that we have erected over the years on our misguided, get tough on crime policy that basically meant that people, when they were convicted of a felony, were often not only put behind bars in a remote location, far away from their families, in a rural area, generally, because often the prisons are located where they can make a profit for a local town. In rural Pennsylvania, for example, where we have a goodly number of them, same in California, Illinois, and a lot of other states. And when you got out, you couldn't get a job, and you couldn't vote, and you couldn't qualify for licenses to do such minor things as being a barber or being a electrician. You would just barred from professions that required licenses, and many states were barred from being in the ballot box. So surprisingly enough, recidivism was, as we said, if we don't let people in and there's no alternative, then that happens over again. We heard from reentering citizens who had made a go of it using social enterprise. John Dyer-Harrell, who will be here. I was hoping he'd be here already, but he will be here tomorrow. Jerry Elster and others who have made a life for themselves and are in a position where they can now do some restorative work in their very own communities because of the work that they started with restorative practices in prison. So we looked at that angle. We also looked at how families were injured and hurt by taking away part of a family member and putting an financial burden on the family at home, not only the burden of perhaps making up for part of a breadwinner, but also with the additional costs of having to try and visit their family member, the exorbitant rates that those who contract with the prison system for telephone service would charge an outrageous amount of money. We looked at the prison industrial complex, and we looked at the disproportionate number of African Americans and people of color generally in this country that were put behind bars to show that it has an incredible disproportionate effect on African Americans. And Michelle Alexander's belief and in her writing says it's deliberate because we have done the dog whistle politics that you're reading about again. Tough on crime meant in particular areas and with particular populations, like let's get tough with African Americans, the same way that even though a majority of the people who are on welfare are European American descended people, the vision that is created by the term welfare queen was meant to evoke without explicitly calling upon a racist card, but it was playing a racist card over and over and over again. So the Get Tough on Crime really had was a vestige of reintroducing Jim Crow as if it had ever really disappeared. Anyway, looking at that, there were many people who said, well, while we are working to dismantle a criminal justice system that really has at its heart putting people of color who are throwaway people, that kind of mentality of let's put them into prison, and at least in the prison industrial complex, we can exploit their labor much as not unlike Parchman in Louisiana, just with a nicer patina. Well, what is it that's going to replace that? Was the call that we had heard from other people. What kind of a system, when we say we want returning citizens to come back into a community, when the community itself has been broken by a mass incarceration system, how do we build community? How do we build community in schools? So instead of there being zero tolerance and we say, oh, well, like 3 strikes and you're expelled, which just separates people from a social system, and it's not unlike what happens in the prison system and guarantees that so many of our people are thrown away and wasted, when what we really need to do is to restore them to a community that's functioning. So this conference was born of the idea that we really need to address not only taking something down that definitely needs taking down, but what can we start to feed and help along the way to support, by the second part of the program's title, Fostering Transformative Justice in Our Communities. Because by doing the restorative work, we are both building communities and having communities that our returning citizens can participate in and have a role in and lead. So enough from my preaching. Why did we invite the people we did? Kay Pranis is, to how many people have heard of Kay before this conference? Yes, that's good. Kay is a teacher and a writer, an author and a speaker. Her works cover the waterfront of restorative practices, and she's been at this for, tell me, 30? Not quite 30 years anyway. Well, it's getting on close to 27 years, let's put it that way. She studied the peacemaking circle work of Native Americans in the Yukon and said, well, this has resonance in our own situation. Something that is an ancient tradition has the wisdom of what it is to live in a community where people have a place. We're going to hear about the destruction of communities when we talk with Esther Etienne and Denise Altvader about the destruction of communities short of prison, but equally devastating. I recommend to you that you read this biography for all of the people in the program that you have, so that I don't spend a lot of time wasting your time. I want to hear from our guest speaker who will be with us throughout our program. And please take advantage of this marvelous, marvelous resource. She is generous with her time beyond belief, and a gentle, soft-spoken person with a very strong and compelling message for all of us. So if we might take a moment of silence, turn off our pagers, cell phones, and other beeping distractions, and settle in for a moment, and then Kay, when you are ready, I'll let you pick up the other microphone and proceed with tonight's lecture, which we entitled Restorative Practices at the Root of Deep Democracy and the Beloved Community, both of which Kay Pranis knows a good bit about. Thank you.
little things are slipping out because I'm always collecting little bits. So thank you so much for inviting me here. And I want to begin by taking a moment to remember the things that I'm grateful for the land and the waters of this particular place, for the plants and animals of this place, for the air that we breathe, for those who walked before us here, for the original caretakers of this land, and for all of you who are here, for this time and space for us to reflect together. This is a precious space. I want to just give you a little bit of perspective on me and how I come to this, because I think it's important to know what lens your speaker is looking through. So the work that I've done in this field, which is now a lot of years, it's quite surprising to me. It was accidental, my coming to this work. It wasn't a vision I had for myself or my role in the world. And I had an experience. I stayed home for 16 years raising my kids, and then started looking for work because my kids were leaving the house, and didn't have credentials for anything. So I very accidentally ended up in the justice system, and then learned about these ideas of restorative justice, which resonate deeply with my own sense of the world. I wouldn't have had the imagination to describe them, but when they were spoken, I resonated and knew that was home for me. So I ended up doing exactly what I think I'm supposed to be doing in the world, but as a gift to me, not because I wasn't even smart enough to be asking what I should be doing in the world. So I had the privilege, actually, of working for the Department of Corrections in Minnesota for 9 years as the restorative justice planner, and my job was just to promote restorative justice around the state, and I was given the freedom to do that any way that I thought was effective. So in the early years, that was in '94 that I went to the Department of Corrections. Nobody had heard of restorative justice, or, well, the Mennonites had, and some Quakers had, but there were very few people who had even heard the term. So a lot of what I did in those first few years was public speaking. And anytime 2 or more people would gather, I would come and talk about these ideas that I loved. And I devised a way to do that involved asking 3 questions to the audience, capturing their answers on flip chart sheets, and then showing them that they had described restorative justice. It was just more engaging than talking at a group of people. And I thought of myself as doing public education. I was doing public education. Until it dawned on me, I wasn't educating anybody. They always had these answers. It wasn't about public education. It wasn't about my wisdom. It's about the wisdom that was always there in the group. And that what we lacked typically were reflective spaces where people could be in touch with their own wisdom and the collective wisdom. So it's how I understand my work. It's not about any wisdom that I have. It is about the collective wisdom and the incredible opportunities I've been given to create spaces where that emerges. So I expect most of what I say tonight, you will say, yeah, I know that. Because you do already know it. And what happens in these spaces is that we help each other remember what we already know. This process of restorative justice, I think, is a process of remembering. Remembering who we are, remembering what we know as human beings. I've done quite a bit of work in Canada, and I had an opportunity once to do a training. Actually, it was a training inside a prison. And quite a few of the guys who were coming were First Nations, and so a couple of the First Nations elders who work with the guys inside also came to this training. And one of them shared this thing that I love. He says, a teaching is the rekindling of a truth we were born with. Teaching is the rekindling of a truth we were born with. So, so I'm going to share some things that I think about, talk about, and get excited about. And it may strike some truths you were born with, and it may not. That's okay. Take what's useful, leave the rest, and I'm just, looking forward to our time together here. So I want to begin by talking about this idea of democracy. And in my work in circles, I gained a whole new perspective on the idea of democracy. Not by myself, of course. I needed some help. And that help came from one of our First Nations teachers who was involved in the right from the beginning. We brought them down 8 or 9 times from Yukon to train us in Minnesota. And his name is Mark Wedge. And we would have these conversations, and in their typical sort of, in my experience, native way, they would pose a question and never answer it. Right? And then you have to struggle with the question. So he posed the question to me at one time in a conversation. He said, why is it you have representation by geography? Why don't you, and you call democracy, right? This is representation. Representative government. Why don't you have representation by interest? And it was like, like twisting my head around because, I grew up in an era when we were taught that the United States was the most democratic country in the world. Nobody did it better than us. And that democracy is majority rule with protection for minority rights. And then he asked me this question, and I'm like, hey, you'd organize that. That's a little complicated. But fundamentally, what he made me think about was that minority interests might never be represented in decisions done in this definition of democracy. Right? Majority rule with protection for minority rights. The protection for minority rights has to be at sort of a baseline. It can't be optimal. It has to be sort of like minimal. And so that in this, what we have called democracy, minority interests could be run over every time in every decision. So he really made me stop and think about what we called democracy. What I had been taught was the ultimate in providing voice and being democratic. And then I had the experience of Circle itself, where we made decisions by consensus. So I want to, but I want to step from that for a moment. So I began thinking about, so what is there in the restorative justice philosophy and the practices that developed out of that that's really congruent with thinking about democracy as engaging all voices. And so in the restorative framework, you have equality of dignity, okay? Should be a fundamental principle of democracy. Equality of dignity. Equality of voice in decisions. Okay? That's a characteristic of the restorative processes, because decisions are made by consensus, that equality of voice in the decisions. The inclusion in restorative processes of all stakeholders in any decision, right? Fundamentally democratic. And another aspect of restorative processes that I was thinking about that I had not thought about, if I just took the word democracy, I wouldn't have thought about this, but looking at democracy and restorative justice, where's their overlap, or where can restorative justice reinforce our sense of being really democratic? And that is the idea of all stories being heard before you make a decision. It's fundamental to restorative processes. No decision until all stories have been heard. I thought, wow, what would that do to our other kinds of decision making, to think about it's necessary to hear all stories before the decision can be taken, and that seems to me that would be really democratic. The other thing, another thing I saw in restorative practices that I started thinking about was really interesting in terms of thinking about democracy, is the idea of the exploration of differences and of common ground. The restorative processes explore the differences, right? The gap that happened in some way, and common ground, both. Okay, that and that the restorative processes have the capacity to face the differences squarely. Right? There's no glossing over those differences. That those have to be held and looked at and deeply understood, at the same time that we also need to find our common ground. And that would be a real contribution to a sense of democracy, to be thinking about how we explore differences in a full way, as well as nurturing our common ground. And the idea of when the differences are really uncomfortable, facing those squarely, being fully present. I mean, that's what happens in the restorative process. You are fully present with the discomfort of the difference that happened in some way, the difficulty that happened in this process. And so I thought, wow. So from the restorative work, which has happened very organically in a grassroots way, and certainly didn't come out of any theory of democracy, I find some practices, practical practices. One of the great things about the restorative justice work, a lot of the ideas are present in lots of other work. They are not unique to the restorative justice work, and they're not new. Right? Very old ideas, and they're not unique to restorative justice. But I think the gift that has come out of the restorative justice movement is these practical ways to practice these abstract ideas. So democracy is an abstract idea. But as we're talking about restorative practices, I think, wow, you can actually practice democracy in a very real way by using the restorative practices. The other the good thing about that, or the bad thing about that, is that because we all cause harm every day of our lives, we get a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of places that we could be trying out these practices of taking responsibility and, in a democratic way, figuring out how to make things right again. So my experience, I'm not a facilitator of the other restorative processes. I'm only a facilitator of Circle. And I've had a lot of experience in Circle. And it was this experience of consensus really kind of turned my head around. And I know a lot of people, I'm talking to Quakers, right? You people know. No, okay. I did not mean to be assuming that you're all Quakers, but this is a Quaker space, and that Quakers have like way more experience than I do in this process of making decisions by consensus. But that experience, it was actually, other than sort of family practice, I think when I got into this work and started doing circles was the first time I really had experience with consensus decision making. And then also the way that Mark Wedge had tweaked with my mind, I began really observing how consensus decision making was different from majority rule, right? Voting. And thinking about that distinction between, because we call that democracy, majority rule with protection for minority rights. And then I was experiencing consensus decision making. I thought, whoa, this is really democracy over here. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was that in a majority rule form of democracy, that what happens is that you try to emphasize differences, and you don't need to look for common ground. You know, you're trying to get your numbers, not by looking for common ground, but by emphasizing how awful the other person is. And that process is a process that continually increases polarization. Right? There's not a search for common ground. There's a constant emphasis on difference, and I believe it's important to hold difference. But if that's the only thing you're working on, you're in trouble, because without common ground, we don't have community. Okay? Community has to sit on some kind of common ground, and so you don't have a healthy society if you don't have common ground. And that the way we are doing our democracy is a way that really encourages polarization. And I think that what we're looking at today is that particular weakness in our system has just, over time, has become bigger and bigger and bigger, and is now the shadow, a huge shadow over the system. Now, I have no idea how you do national elections by consensus. But as I sat in circle, I kept thinking, okay, we have to figure out how to do more of this at the micro level. And that we're really infants at this. And that if we do more and more of this with what's close in, we'll get better at figuring out how do we at least carry the ethic? Because I think that that's part of it. It's the ethic that you're cultivating in a consensus process. Because the way I understand consensus in the work that I do in circles, so we define that as everyone can live with it, which we understand to mean that everyone can walk out the door and support the decision. And I began to see this, and a lot of you folks may have seen this long before I did, but I began to understand that it was not just a description of where people had to be for the decision to go forward, but that it's a philosophy. That consensus for me became a philosophy about taking care of everyone over time. Not in every decision. You can't take care of everyone in every decision. So we teach in when I'm training circle that if you can't live with it, it's important to say no. We actually have way more trouble with people not saying no when that's where they are than the other way. It's very important to say no, but no is not like a veto. And I experienced this early on. We had a sentencing circle process where the prosecutor was saying no to every case we wanted to take, and all of a sudden I realized, whoa, no. He's treating this like veto. That's a different thing. That if you say no, you have an active obligation to help the group figure out what you could live with and still allows the group to move forward. So you have to be active if you say no in the process of helping the group figure out something else. You can't just say no and be passive. So the individual has to pay attention to his or her impact on the group. So if you're stopping something, you now have a responsibility to pay attention to your impact on the group. Okay? Individual has to pay attention to the impact on the group. On the other end of that continuum, you had an interest, you expressed that, people really listened, really respected that, tried to find a way to meet that. Nobody could quite figure out how to meet that. You might stand aside in that interest and support the decision going forward. Okay? In that case, the group has an ongoing responsibility to that individual, either to meet that interest in a future decision, or if it doesn't belong there, help them figure out where else they go, right? To support the person in figuring out where they go to meet that need if it's something that group can't meet. In that case, the group has to pay attention to their impact on the individual. And that it's this balance of the individual paying attention to their impact on the group paying attention to their impact on the individual, that is what healthy community is about. And that no group should be running over the same individual, and no individual should be constantly stopping the group from moving forward. And the great thing about Circle, a lot of people have had bad experience with consensus. And the great thing about Circle is that it has built into the process characteristics that are conducive to groups making decisions by consensus. Because consensus done well is incredibly hard work. And it takes persistence, it takes patience, it takes the willingness to go to an uncomfortable place. It takes, you need to be flexible. I mean, we do this exercise where we come up with a list of about 20 characteristics from the exercise, and then I point out to them that all of those characteristics apply to making decisions by consensus. And it's really hard work. So you have to know what's the source of energy to do the hard work in a group of people. And two things that I've identified that can be a source of energy to do the hard work of consensus building are shared vision. Okay? A powerful shared vision will help people get past the stuck places. I'm going to give you an example of this. My friend Jane Miller Ashton worked for Correctional Service Canada. In the early 90s, there was a crisis around the women's prison there. And they created a task force to decide what to do about that. And the task force decided that they should build 6 prisons across the country. There had been a single one. And that they should build a healing lodge for federally sentenced First Nations women, because of the history of historical trauma, that First Nations women were more overrepresented. First Nations being the terminology generally used in Canada for Native people. That they were overrepresented in the system. So they were going to build this healing lodge, which would be a prison but based on First Nations culture. And my friend Jane was put in charge of the planning process for this healing lodge. And they had a task force that was mostly people outside of corrections itself and was almost all First Nations people, a number of whom had actually been in the system. And they had decided that their entire planning process would be done in Circle. And they were assigned 2 elders to help them in this process. And so everybody except my friend Jane pretty much is carrying historical trauma and trauma from perhaps having been in the system. So they frequently got at loggerheads with each other, right? They'd get really stuck with each other. The elders would get them all to stand up. They'd go down to the end of the hotel room they were meeting in. The elders would burn sage to sort of cleanse them off. And then the elder would say, "Why are you here?" And they'd go around one by one and say, "We're here to build a healing lodge for federally sentenced First Nations women." That vision was so powerful that it would give them the energy to go back and either let go of something they were stuck on or do the hard work of getting their way through. So a shared vision is a powerful source of energy for. Now, it isn't always that positive. So we did sentencing circles, and in that process, you have the person who was hurt, their supporters, the person who caused the harm, their supporters, some of the justice system professionals, any community member who wanted to be part of the process. They didn't necessarily have any sense of shared vision, but a powerful shared interest. If they came to consensus, they had a voice in the final decision of what the sentence would be. If they couldn't come to consensus, the decision reverts to the judge. No voice. So the shared interest was to have a voice in the process. And that would be powerful enough to keep people in when they might be sick and tired of it. So that idea of shared vision or shared interest is a source of energy for consensus decision making. The other source of energy for getting to consensus is relationship. People being in relationship and caring about each other. So caring about how this impacts the other person. Those two things are nurtured in Circle, so it's easier to do consensus decision making in Circle than it is in a lot of other processes. But that was quite a journey for me to begin to really understand this idea that this is about a philosophy of taking care of everybody. That's what consensus is about, and that should be. So we've thought about democracy in this very sort of heady way. We need democracy and caring to be woven in together, and that's what happens in that kind of consensus kind of process. I want to share with you an image that came out in one of my trainings. I've been talking about the circle, the nature of the circle, this idea about consensus, and he says, I get it. He said it's like explorer rather than conqueror in a decision-making process. And I went, whoo, that completely resonated. I served on a school board for 9 years. There were 7 of us on that board. I loved collective decision-making. I really liked that because I thought you could be crazy, right? And you're passionate about something, and there were 6 other people that would keep you from running off the cliff. Right? So you could allow your passion to run, right, and be really intense about something without putting everybody at risk. And so I liked collective decision making. But when I thought back to my years on the board, and I thought, yeah, I was in conqueror mode. I'm not, a real. I'm not aggressive. But I would do all my background work, read the stuff, talk to people, decide what I thought was the best idea, go to the meeting to persuade others that this was the best idea. And what I learned in Circle was the idea of coming in. You can come in with all your passion about how you see it, and then you're open to hearing the passion of how everybody else sees it, and that your stance is this stance of explorer rather than conqueror. And that this experience in Circle has helped me to feel the difference between those two places. And I really like explorer better. Right? Circles are never about persuasion. They're just about offering the truth as you see it, with all the intensity that you want to bring in that moment. Another advantage that when I started thinking about majority rule versus consensus, it was like the other really big thing that jumped out at me besides this problem of polarization is that you might get a decision that a whole lot of people want to see fail. That you actually can have significant commitment to failure for implementation of the decision. And that's really rough when you think about it. A consensus decision, you've got commitment to implementation. And it's a whole different set of circumstances. It generally makes implementation go faster, more effective, all those benefits that you get out of it. But it was really powerful for me to start to think about what that meant about the degree to which energy might be committed to failure of some kind of decision, because the process polarizes and separates and leaves some people feeling that, in fact, they're not represented in the decision. So, just some thoughts about, looking at this restorative justice work and the restorative practices, and then how that fits with thinking about democracy. So, what's our time parameter here? I definitely want time for questions. That's why I'm trying to sort it out. Okay, so let me just say a bit about power. Yeah. So Carolyn Boyce Watson and I, who've done a couple of books together, have in that process, led by Carolyn, mind you. I'm a good follower, but she's really the lead thinker in this work. But we really started thinking more consciously about the question of power. And first of all, for me, it's important to acknowledge that there's a fundamental human need, right? It is one of our basic human needs to experience a sense of personal power and autonomy. So that's a fundamental human need. And a lot of things that happen that are harmful to others happen because people are trying to access power. They're feeling powerless, they're trying to access power, and they will resort to means that harm others because that need is so great. So democracy, at its best. I also want to note, I meant to say this earlier, that restorative practices are not always achieving all these things I'm describing. Right? The practice isn't necessarily that good, but this is the conceptual frame, and I think if we keep working at it, we can get better at achieving those kinds of things. But just want to note, this is not necessarily what you would see in every restorative practice that's going on. But democracy at its best is an experience of healthy personal power that is not at the expense of someone else's power. So if someone's causing harm out of a sense of powerlessness and the need to feel some kind of power, taking more power away is not very helpful. And that's mostly what we do to people. That we need to help them experience having power in a way that doesn't harm others and doesn't take away from someone else's power. The restorative practices are really good at this. First, the voice, the democratic decision-making and experience of power. The other thing in the restorative practices that really is helpful for a sense of personal power is the deep listening. It's embedded in our culture that the degree to which people will listen to you is the degree to which you have power. People will listen to what the president had for breakfast, and there are a bunch of people who never get listened to at all, whose story is never heard. It's very much a function of power in our culture, whether or not your story is taken seriously, whether you are deeply listened to. So all of the practices, all the restorative practices, involve deep listening. And being a listener is a way of offering someone else that experience of personal power. So the restorative practices are really, they help us to turn some of the power stuff upside down. And if restorative processes are not transferring power, we haven't got it yet. I think all restorative processes should be transferring power. There was a misalignment of power that happened before this harm, and the restorative process needs to help us begin to pay attention to realigning the power. There is another piece too, that the idea all restorative processes should be treating everyone with dignity and no differences, no distinctions about level of dignity. Everyone has dignity in the restorative process. That is also an experience of personal power. Right? To be treated with dignity is an experience of personal power. Another piece of that, when in Circle, we really try to get away from the labels. The idea is that something's gone wrong, and we all need to figure out what we need to do, get things back where we want, or get things aligned in a more appropriate way. And so we don't think of the person who might have caused harm with a label. That person is just another person on the rim of the circle to help us figure out how to get to a better place. So everyone is presumed to have gifts and something positive to contribute to the process of getting to a better place from wherever we are. And so that assumption, that being seen as having a positive contribution to make, that's also an experience of personal power. So there are multiple ways that these processes are offering the possibility of a sense of personal power and autonomy that every one of us needs, and that then is sort of the antidote to people trying to get power by power over someone else. Yeah. So So these restorative processes provide an experience of meeting needs through positive personal power, and a power that's experienced with others. So the seed of profound democracy is present in these restorative processes all the time. So, yeah, the other thing I want to touch on before we sort of open it up is that for me this work is about really big cultural change, really big cultural shifts, and this is where the idea of beloved community for me fits in. That this is about changing the way we see and relate to one another in all dimensions at all levels. That's for me that we're talking about seeing ourselves as profoundly interconnected. Harm to you is harm to me. Right? So I can't participate in harming anyone else because that's ultimately harm to me as well. And because I work in Circle all the time, I've come to understand several of these concepts as coming from ancient wisdom, ancient understandings about living in community. And so one of the ways I think about this is if you think about the circle as an image that's a metaphor for a worldview. It's an image that describes how the universe operates metaphorically. Then there's several implications of that image that I see that are very important in this big culture shift. One is this idea of equality, right? In a circle, no point is more important than any other point. There's no hierarchy. So the idea of quality is embedded in the image of a circle, and that this beloved community is a community of fundamental equality. Another idea that comes from me with that image of a circle is that there's a sense of motion, the sense of motion around the circle. Also the idea of no beginning, no end, sort of continuous change, but there's a pattern to it, so you have a sense of cycles. In that, there's a sense that we always come around again. There is always another chance. So this is equality, there's always another chance. And the idea of a sort of sense of fluidity that rigid structures don't work well. There's a sense of fluidity in a circle. And then that one about connectedness. This everything in the circle is connected to, every point is connected to every other point in the circle. That the nature of the universe is this profound interconnectedness. It's not just desirable, it is inherent in the universe, such that it is not possible to drop out, kick out, or get rid of anything. Right? That's not a possibility. We think we do that, and we're operating under an illusion of some kind, and it bites us in the back because we're not paying attention to the fact that we are still connected. And I think we've finally kind of gotten this idea around the environmental issues. 40, 50 years ago, we threw a bottle out the window and thought we threw it away. Turned out there was no away. That wherever we threw it, it was still impacting our earth, our water, and that the same thing is true around our relationships with people. Doesn't mean there are times when we need a little space. I'm not saying you always have to be up close and intimate, but that we understand we're still connected. And that it is the nature of the universe that you can't possibly disconnect, right? That, to me, those ideas are fundamental to this concept of beloved community, and they're in the restorative framework for me as well. Now, other people might have. I don't want to claim that I say what restorative justice is. Just talking about, from my perspective, those are in the restorative work, and especially in circles, because that's where I spend most of my time. There's a biologist by the name of Mary Clark who says the two most fundamental human needs are meaning and belonging. And if she's right, we have created a culture that systematically thwarts the two most fundamental human needs, meaning and belonging. And the restorative processes are really helpful. They're very much about connecting and belonging and not kicking out. And they talk about what really matters. In these processes, we talk about what really matters. So meaning comes to the surface in these processes. The other thing that is emerging for me that's interesting to think about is that moving toward this beloved community, this profound cultural shift, that one of the most important skills is the ability to not know. And that's deeply countercultural. And we live in a culture that gives you more status, more worthiness, more value if you have answers. And the more answers you have, the higher you go. And the more risky it is for you to not know. And the higher you go, the greater the risk and the greater the fear you have of not having the answer, because you're supposed to have the answers. And this work asks us to not know, because we're working to access the collective wisdom. And if any one of us goes into a process thinking we know, we will try to drive that process toward what we know, and we could bypass the collective wisdom, which is always going to be greater than what one any individual knows. And so and because that there's so much about it that just has to allow things to emerge within a framework of values. Okay? We're not talking about a free-for-all. We're talking about a very clear framework of values and principles. But within that, things have to move and emerge in an organic way. And so it means that we have to sit with ambiguity and uncertainty and not knowing exactly how it's going to get to where it's going to get to. And it's messy. It's really messy and sometimes really, really uncomfortable. And so the skill that I think we have to nurture is the ability to not know and the willingness to sit in uncertainty. And that's challenging because we might spend a lifetime to get to that place of status that we feel about knowing. We have invested so heavily. And this is important for me to remember. I'm working with folks who are resistant to these wonderful ideas. Right? Because I'm asking people to feel incompetent. To not know is to feel incompetent in this culture. And so we are asking the people in these systems to feel competent, to going to a place of huge uncertainty. And so it's a lot to ask. And so it helps me to have patience. So with that, I want to open it up to a conversation with you, reflections, questions, any place you'd like to take it.
This is John again, and because we are also, this is live streaming to some folks at home, I would appreciate it if you would wait until I come to you so that those questions can be recorded as well, so that our conversation is as inclusive of those who are not in the room as possible. So, would you care to call on the people that you see first, and then I will point them out and I'll carry the mic to them. Also, you want to speak right close to it like a lollipop.
Like a lollipop, exactly.
Okay. I appreciated hearing about the principles of the circle. I would love to know a little bit more about the process, of what actually happens, what you would say to start a circle, what kind of circles exist, how long they last, what actually happens in the room. Thanks.
So I'll give you a very quick overview because what you described is kind of like a 3-day training. But so it's a process in which people sit in a circle of chairs with no table in the center. Geometry matters. There's something about that form that's powerful for human beings. It It's related to sense of connection, common focus, and huge accountability. Everyone can see everyone else, and there's a really significant accountability happening. There's also maybe something happening energetically that we don't necessarily understand, because people really feel the difference of not having a table. Now, why would that be, right? Something's going on between our bodies that we feel the difference. So people feel more vulnerable, but that ultimately opens up a space for people to be more connected. So we sit in a circle. We often have some things in the center that maybe represent important concepts of the group, or like a shared vision of the group that's in the center. And we add to the center, for instance, we name values that we want to guide us in the process, and those are put in the center. The circle uses a tool called a talking piece, which is an object which is passed from person to person, and you can only speak when you have that object. And it's always okay to pass. And that's an interesting thing, because you're using a talking piece, as a facilitator, you have way less power than you would do in other kinds of facilitation. Because in most other kinds of facilitation, facilitator decides who speaks next. In a circle, you don't have that power. Talking piece is going around, and that regulates the dialogue, and you don't interrupt unless something has gone way wrong. So what happens is the power that's normally sitting with the facilitator gets spread around the circle, and all participants take up responsibility for both process and any decisions that are made, any outcomes. We do some kind of opening and closing, some very deliberate opening and closing, because this is a space apart. This is a space which we're going to work to make safer than our normal spaces. And in that space, people may choose to drop some of their masks and protections that we normally wear around in the world. And so there's often the opportunity for deeper dialogue in the process. The space is also intentional about saying you get to come as a whole human being. You get to bring your mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual truth into this space. Emotions are welcome. How you make meaning out of life is also welcome in this space. Space is intentional about that. Those are the primary ways in which it looks different than other kinds of processes. There's another very important one, and that is that the process is extremely intentional about working on relationships before talking about difficult issues. That you're going to build some common ground together before you try to deal with the really tough differences that you hold. And that's a very important characteristic of the process. You're welcome.
May I ask a question? Because I've kind of set the program up so that we have discussion circles, and we have some facilitators who I just know can call people together, but they may not have been trained in the circle processes. But one of the things that you and I talked about doing was experiencing the circle process while we're in this group. So even as we are trying to understand it up here, we're also trying to see how to practice it. And the discussions were going to be on our reactions and our understanding of the content that's been presented. How will that work if we haven't already been trained in it? And I'm certain that I bring my thought that it sounds somewhat idealistic to say that we get into a circle, but we still are bringing a lot of the baggage of our status, our role, our you said we don't emphasize that, but yet you are still coming with all of who you are. Anyway, let's just go with the first part of that, which is how can we do this without already knowing what it is we're doing?
It's actually not a very complicated process, so we'll be fine with that. There are a couple of key things to know. One is that it's critical to use the talking piece, and that you have that go in order. It does not bounce around. Okay, and that will and you generally try to start by taking a moment like you did before I came up. Right, so we take a moment to settle, to help people be present, and then you make sure the talking piece goes in order. And this will be okay because these are talking circles. So it's not okay for a conflict circle. You need training for a conflict circle. I just want to be very clear about that. So these are talking circles, reflection circles after hearing some speakers. And because though you're not trying to deal with something, the topics may be difficult, or they might even be emotional, but they're not about conflict between participants in the circle. So that kind of talking circle, people don't need a lot of training for that. You could read the little book, sit in a couple of circles, and facilitate a talking circle. So we'll be fine here because people will know what the topic will be, whatever they heard. And it'll be a process of, passing the talking piece around and people taking turns reflecting. You would just have to, all of us will just have to be mindful about time, depending on how long we have and how big the group is, to make sure there's time for everybody to speak. It's really, really nice if you can go around more than once, because the first go around stimulates people's thinking for a second go around. So, in our groups, when we get into them, just be mindful about time with the idea that you'd like to have 2 go-rounds. The other question I am going to speak to as well, because this is an important question. The circle levels a lot. It can't level everything. But one of the ways we do that is symbolic measure. So when the folks from the judge and the First Nations people trained us for the sentencing circles, they taught us that in the circle, the judge is on a first-name basis. Right? Very symbolic. The lawyers all choked. It was funny to me because I've never worked in a courtroom, so I don't have any of that. It was easy for me to call them by first name, but the lawyers really have a hard time with that. But it's very powerful. And then when we took them into schools, we were following the same pattern of what we had been doing in the community, because we started with the circles in the justice system, and then they moved into schools. So if the principal was in the circle, he was on a first name basis. In the circle, the kids never got confused. They did not call him by his first name in the hallway. People can make that distinction. So that's one way in which you're trying to remind people, right? You keep it alive that in this space, everybody can state their needs, but no voice should have any more weight than any other voice. And the other thing that you do in circles that are about difficult issues, in that part of the circle where you're building the relationships and the common ground, you invite stories from people's lives that are about the shared human struggle. Tell about a time you had to make a change in your life and it was really, really tough and you dreaded it. Right? And the people who are normally in a power position, if they share in those kinds of rounds, it really levels things out. Now people are still conscious that they do have their power when they walk back out again. And there needs to be an awareness about that. But in the space of the circle, you actually can level that out quite a bit. Okay, David, and then...
So I think there's a question, but put a couple things together. The Search Institute's done thousands of surveys with middle and high school kids. And they have 2 findings that I've thought about for many years. One is that 74% of youth do not feel valued by their community. Another, about 74% do not feel that schools teach them how to solve problems. And so what I've seen in circles with young people, or mix of adults and young people, some young people in trouble, some not, is that because in a circle we decide the values of our circle. Everybody owns those values. We have gradually created a community that says one of our values, and two always appear. One is respect, and the other is non-judgment. Two extreme. Non-judgment is so important. So in the past, I always thought, well, students being valued by adults. But now I've come to realize, I don't know if it's as powerful, but whether you see, it is at least as powerful for young people to value each other, their insights, their experiences, that sometimes they're not as different as they think they are. Sometimes they're even more different. And that this is a form of being valued, in addition to learning how to solve conflicts, being valued that we really don't have, right? And that this is very powerful. And when you see young people who've been at it with each other begin to listen to each other, I call it just the magic of the talking piece. That when you're a young person and you have that space to be heard, how often in a school day does a young person get heard? Well, it's very small. But here, and my students tell me this as well, is experiencing each other as human beings, not as a student, not as a teacher, not as a youth, not as a adult, but as a human being. And this, to me, is probably as liberating an experience, certainly for an adult, and for us to come to know each other as human beings with needs, goals, dreams. And sometimes you can have a 14-year-old talking to a 67-year-old, and it's like, wow, we are sharing similarities that allow us to grow closer together and be concerned about each other. So does that make sense?
I agree. I just completely agree. It's the connections and the valuing each other is really important. And I want to add to that is that what they can do for each other. I did a training in Roxbury, Massachusetts for mental health program that was created as a transitional mental health program between the adolescent mental health system and the adult mental health system. And these young people were all wards of the state. So parental rights had long since been terminated. And so they created this transition program. It was kind of like a drop-in place, open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And I did training for the staff, and we had about 6 of the young people in the training as well. They had said to me ahead of time, can we have some of the young people in the training? And I said, of course. He said, well, they all have mental health, pretty severe mental health problems. They might have to leave. I said, we can work with that. And they said, an adult might have to go with them. And I said, that's okay, we can work with that. In fact, it was a 3-day training. In fact, none of them left. And they tended to be a little late getting there in the morning, but none of them left. So sometime, a few months after I had done the training, I was talking with the director there, and he told me that the staff initially decided would do check-in circle every Monday morning, because these people were street involved, gang involved, court system involved. A lot of them had already done time in jail. And so their weekends are pretty chaotic. They do a check-in circle Monday morning. So they very quickly decided they should do check-in circle Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, because there was less demand for one-on-one counselor time if they sat in circle with each other. And that a lot of the talk now about trauma needs to look at the potential of the importance of community. Community is where you heal from trauma, because trauma is disconnection. It's one of the deep aspects of trauma is disconnection. And that community, getting reconnected, is an important part of healing from trauma. And young people can do that for each other, even if they are in trauma themselves. And so, for me, it's a very important part. And young people can facilitate circles. It doesn't take long working with them and having them sit in a circle to experience it before they're very capable of doing that. So one more story about that. Heard this story from someone who was in an alternative school in Baltimore, and she had been doing circles in the school, some work with staff, some work with students. She heard this story from a math teacher, high school math teacher in an alternative school. Kids are having trouble with the subject. They're struggling with the content. And one of the kids in the class says, "We need a circle." The teacher says, "I don't do circles. We had a little bit of training, but I don't do circles." And the kid says, "Well, I do." And the teacher allowed this student to organize the class in a circle, conducted a circle, and as a result of that circle, the teacher went home and over the weekend reorganized his curriculum. The kid initiated it, the kid conducted it, and somehow what the young people were able to articulate helped the teacher understand how to teach more effectively. So it's, yeah, that one's a pretty exciting one. We need to get to you.
I was curious what the 3 questions were that you started your work with when you went to a group and you said
RJ
I had
101.
3 questions.
Yep. I actually have that written up. So I don't know. Is there a system for sending something out to everyone? So if everybody wanted this.
There is.
Okay. So
Everyone is going to be on a contact list, and anyone can send anyone else on the list at the end of the weekend.
So if you want, I can send this out to everyone. So I've written it up because this question came up so many times when I mentioned that I had this. The first question is about, it's a process that you have to facilitate, so a little bit more than just the questions. But the core questions are, what are the forces that shape our behavior? First of all, noting, we all make hundreds of decisions every day, and we mostly make those decisions in a way that we can live safely with one another. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. And so I get the group to identify what are the forces that result in us choosing to do the right thing most of the time. And I also note that the criminal justice system is intended to shape people's behavior. Right? We try to use the criminal justice system to shape people's behavior. Then I have people think about what are the forces that actually shape our behavior. And then we identify which ones the justice system has access to, which is usually only like 2 out of a list of 12. And we talk about where those other forces operate in the context of family and community. And so the observation is that there are all these forces that shape behavior. Only 2 of them can be leveraged by the justice system, and we're asking the justice system to manage all kinds of behavior it has no tools for. So gives a little perspective on that. Then the second question is about victimization. And I invite people not to go to a place of trauma, but to think of a time that they felt unfairly treated or hurt in not a traumatic way, and ask about the feelings. We make a list of the feelings, and then the needs. We make a list of the needs. And then the third question is keeping in mind what we know about what shapes behavior and what's needed if you were hurt in some way, what those feelings are, what you need. What would you want to be true of a good process in the community to resolve conflict and harm? So basically, I elicit from the group the characteristics they would want this process, a good process to resolve conflict and harm. What would they want to be the characteristics of that process? And every time I've ever done it, what you get is a description of a good restorative process. And I've done it with all kinds of groups across all kinds of differences. It's just and then what I would do in an RJ 101 is I say, okay, so you've captured this. Howard Zare has put it into this elegant form. But it's the same things that you were just saying, and yeah. Somebody will have to email me to remind me to send this.
Okay, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. I wanted to ask about whether the restorative circle can be used for creativity and innovation. So what struck me as you were speaking about people coming to affirm their voice, affirm the voice of other people, sharing that, my understanding of organizational development and what people are doing now to get employees to become more active and to participate more in building the business, it's remarkably similar to what you were describing. When teams are actually allowed to have a voice, everybody gets a voice in the team, those teams perform much better than, well, one or a few dominating the team or the group. And so I'm wondering, in all these different contexts, we've talked about schools and young people now having a voice, finally being heard. There are a lot of employees out there who are just disengaged. They're just going through the motions. And when they're given a chance to have a voice, because they've got a great idea, and then they work together, and an even greater idea comes out of the sharing. It's really powerful. And I'm wondering, have you moved into other contexts, whether it's nonprofit, public or private sector, just in organizations where this leads to higher functioning groups?
Yeah, there are some places where that's happening.
Yeah.
So the first way in which we got more into organizations was for workplace conflict among employees. People have used restorative processes. But also then, because the circle is both an intervention you can use when there's conflict or some kind of problem, but it's also a community building process. So you can use circle just to strengthen a community when there's no particular problem. So the circle has both sides, which the other restorative processes are primarily as an intervention. So people have been using circles for workplace conflict to some degree, but people are also using it for team building in the workplace. There's an organization in Nashville that's in the healthcare field. The leader of that organization had been to a circle training, really loved the process, and so he, in his company, everybody's divided up into groups of 10 that are cross-disciplinary, and every month that group of 10 has a 2-hour circle with no agenda and no particular purpose, just to keep nurturing the relationships and the sense of belonging. So one of the things I want to say about that is, of course, performance would be better, because the safer we are, the safer we feel, the more we can access higher cortex, right? That's coming out of a lot of the brain research, that when we're fearful or angry, right, it closes down till we're way down in the primitive brain. So the more we are safe, the higher and higher we're going to be able to go in our mental capacity in the brain, in our analytic capacity. And that's a space that allows everyone voice, a space that treats everyone respectfully. It gets safer. And so more of our wisdom emerges. And this is unconscious. It's not that we're consciously withholding because we don't feel safe. It's that we can't get up there if we don't feel safe. So it makes complete sense that you're creating space where everybody has voice, and and know when they use their voice they won't be ridiculed, right? It's very respectful. Then we can access more of our capacity. And then you do that collectively, and it's like, whoa. Yeah. And that's why it's so important in schools. Kids are going to do better on tests when they feel like safe and like they belong, because they're just going to be able to access more of those higher abilities.
I have never heard of this restorative. This is completely new to me. And as I listened to what you said, what everyone else said in their comments, I think it comes down to one short paragraph that I took down that you said. healthy personal power. You need a way to experience power without taking power away from others or hurting others. I think, to me, if I'm on the right track, this seems to be everything that you're saying in just a different way. Am I on track here? Am I clueless?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, I think that does capture a lot of what we're talking about. We just need lots of different ways to say these things because there's so many angles
yeah,
to what we're looking at. Yep.
Talked about the kids. When you just talked about kids doing better, they felt that they had a stake in it, that they had power.
They have personal power. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. It would reflect that. Yes.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That was a wonderful summary.
I live in Boston, so I know Roxbury pretty well, and I congratulate you. And it's actually improving in Roxbury. But my major question is, I'm so excited about hearing that. I'd like to hear that you're doing this all over the country somehow, or in every school, or, but is there forward motion on this and some reason that we can be optimistic that we can actually make a difference?
So I've been at this since 1989. And what's happening right now compared to any year up to about 2 years ago is pretty energized. So schools, the folks, it's because of 10 years of work in the school to prison pipeline movement that they finally really got traction and were able to put enough pressure. This did not come from the schools themselves. It came from grassroots organizing, and they finally embarrassed the schools. For a long time, the data wasn't available. When they finally got their hands on the data, the schools were so embarrassed that they had to do something different. So there's rapid change happening in schools. It's a little tricky. Actually growing too fast. There aren't enough people out there who deeply understand the big shift. So people are learning some of the surface practices, which may improve things. But so we're in a period of lots of people suddenly trying to use these processes. There's some risk that it'll be shallow implementation and then won't have the impact we want, and then people will say, we tried that. That's where we are. There's wonderful work in Oakland. There's one that, and the work in Oakland is the restorative justice work, very hooked to equity work. And in Chicago, wonderful community working in Chicago. The Chicago public schools are a mess, very, very difficult, but the grassroots work in Chicago is fabulous. Now, when I say that, we need to understand that we're still talking margins. We're just talking about a little bit of stuff on the edge, but way more than there was before. And there's a systems recognition that they have to do something different, and they have to reduce suspensions. So for every system that began to feel that pressure to reduce suspensions, this became sort of an obvious answer. So that's very encouraging. We're also seeing movement in a couple places in using these approaches in child welfare. And the juvenile justice stuff, it's been slow to grow, but it looks like some things are opening up there. So, and I actually think that this is the direction of the universe if human beings last long enough. We're doing a lot that puts that at risk, but this is the direction of the universe. The modern sciences, modern biology and modern physics, teach about interconnectedness the same way that circle is deeply rooted in interconnectedness. So there's a lot about this work that actually suggests, and that our institutional structures are still based on the Newtonian understanding of the world, right? The sciences have moved on to an Einsteinian understanding of the world, right, to chaos theory and that kind of stuff. That stuff, this work is closer to the understandings in chaos theory and quantum physics. So, history would suggest that we are eventually going to get out of the Newtonian worldview. That is, if we don't, harm ourselves too much before that happens. And what I see is not just the restorative justice movement, but these core ideas are in a whole lot of other movements and initiatives. So it's like when the time is right, the idea pops up all over the place. And it's pretty grassroots. It's very hard to see at the top. But I was born an optimist, so. But I think there's just way more going on than there was 5 years ago.
I saw one more question before we probably might do well to close for the evening. Some people have traveled a good bit. And there will be opportunities to interact with Kay throughout the course of the conference over meals, and she'll be responding tomorrow as well. I'm going to give... Okay, then I was going to say in as a coda to what Kay was just saying, tomorrow you've actually set the stage for our first panel with Keith Hickman, who's here, and will be joined by some of his colleagues from the International Institute for Restorative Practices. It's doing the Safer, Saner Schools whole systems approach to keep it from being shallow and not successful. And then we go, oh well, we tried that and it didn't work. How do you build it into the whole school so that everyone has a stake in its success? That shared vision that you were talking about is so fundamental to the process. Let us please.
I want to do a closing reading.
Okay.
If we're ready for that.
Give you a hand, but no.
Not yet.
Let's hear the reading.
Because I learned this lesson from circles, and I do it in all my speaking as well, is to do an opening and a closing. From Howard Zinn. We don't have to engage in grand, heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can quietly become a power no government can suppress, a power that can transform the world. If we do act in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents. And to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Thank you so much for being here tonight.